I'm Gemma Briggs. I'm a lecturer in psychology here at the Open University, and my research interest is in mobile phone use and driving. We use this kind of rudimentary driving simulator setup to run lots of different experiments to find out what people can and can't do whilst driving a car. If you do more than one thing whilst trying to drive a car, then it's distracting, which is pretty unsurprising really. But in this country, it's illegal to have a handheld phone conversation whilst driving, which suggests, as research has supported, that it's pretty dangerous to do so. But many people feel that it's perfectly safe to have a hands-free phone conversation whilst driving because they've got both hands available to steer the vehicle. However, a lot of research has suggested that this isn't the case, and this is something that the current research project that we're undertaking at the moment is hoping to prove further. So when you try and do two things whilst driving, your driving performance deteriorates. By this we mean that you might not notice hazards such as someone jumping out in front of your car. You may not notice traffic lights changing colour at the last minute. You'll show longer braking distances and stopping times, so your reaction times will be a lot longer than a driver who is solely concentrating on driving. And you won't be able to judge gaps quite so well, so you may well think that your vehicle can fit between two other cars when in reality it can't. So to throw a few statistics into the mix, you're around 4 times more likely to be involved in an accident if you're having a phone conversation, either handheld or hands-free. Now, what's of particular interest to me is that a study in 1997 showed that even after 5 minutes of ending your phone conversation, you're still 4 times more likely to be involved in an accident. So what that tells us is it's something cognitive. There's something going on in the human brain which affects dual tasking performance. So the research that we're interested in carrying out at the moment looks into attention and perception, and how dual tasking whilst driving can affect an individual's ability to allocate their attention to the driving task. So we want to know, do people switch their attention between the task of driving and talking on the phone, or do they try and divide their attention? If they divide their attention, how do they decide which task is the most important? We'd hope and we'd assume that people would think that driving safely is the most important task. But there's a great human tendency when a phone rings to suddenly divert your attention off in that direction. Okay, so the research that we're hoping to carry out now will be a continuation of what we've already looked at, hopefully mainly simulator based, and we've got a plan to use a PlayStation and Grand Theft Auto, a game that lots of people play for pleasure, but something that we think we can manipulate to our benefit. So what we'll do is we'll have 2 PlayStations, and we'll have one of our research team in another room affecting or interacting with the game that our participant is playing. So we can have somebody open a car door in front of our participant's vehicle, we can have them jump out of the car or cause some kind of hazard. The benefit being we know exactly when that hazard's going to happen, and we can measure their performance and how they react to that. So again, we'll be looking at their eye movements because we've got some really rich and interesting data beforehand with the other studies, so it'll be interesting to see what happens in a more kind of dynamic and realistic environment. We'll be looking at the number of hazards they notice, and looking at something which psychologists term the look but failed to see error, which is a very cannily named thing, which suggests if we look at people's eye movements, they can comment on, no, I didn't see that and that's why I didn't react to it, but we've got the eye data showing that they did indeed look at that hazard or whatever. And hopefully that will help us to explain further the individual factors which explain why dual tasking whilst driving doesn't really seem to work, in that your driving performance is always going to deteriorate one way or another. one of the experiments we carried out was interested in looking at the individual aspects of phoning or driving which might affect driving performance. So we came up with a question, well, is a more emotionally involving or anxiety inducing conversation more distracting than a more mundane conversation? So if you're upset about something or anxious about something, is that going to distract you more than, say, having a conversation with your partner about what you're going to buy in the supermarket on your way home? So it was quite a challenging thing to come up with because we wanted to have a conversation task for all of our participants that would be anxiety inducing for half of our participants but not for the other. And rather cruelly, the only example that we could come up with was to use a phobic sample. So what we did was we recruited a group of spider phobics as a phobia that's very common in the general population, and the remainder of our sample didn't have a phobia of spiders. And what we asked them to do was to drive this simulator, follow a normal route along a dual carriageway. We asked them to drive as normally as possible. So stick to the speed limit, don't crash into other vehicles, mirror, signal, manoeuvre, all of the things that you're taught in your highway code. And at the same time, we asked them to have a conversation via a hands-free mobile phone on the topic of spiders. Now, understandably, for our phobic sample, this induced a certain level of anxiety. For our non-phobic sample, they were perfectly happy and perfectly fine to have that discussion. What we did was we measured their driving performance, so we recorded how many accidents they had, how many speed deviations or lane deviations they made, and we also measured their eye movements because we wanted to know specifically what drivers look at whilst they're dual tasking. So all of our drivers drove once without distraction, so that was their own control condition, and then once whilst having this conversation. We measured the eye movements because there's quite a bit of research to suggest that when you're doing two things at once, your visual patterns, your visual fixation patterns as we call them, alter quite dramatically. So you tend to focus straight ahead of you in a really compacted area. Psychologists call this visual tunnelling. But we were interested to know, well, could we call this cognitive tunnelling as well? Because we're affecting their attention and their perception, and therefore this squashing effect happens. So what we found was that our phobic participants were more distracted than our non-phobic participants. Now, to be clear here, all participants who dual tasked, regardless of whether they were phobic or non-phobic, showed a decrease in their driving performance when they were doing two things at once. So we're not saying if you have a phobia of spiders, you can't talk on the phone or have a conversation whilst you're driving. But what we are saying is that our phobic sample, our phobic participants, showed an even greater decrease in driving performance than our non-phobic participants. So we found that they took longer to react to hazards, they made more driving errors, and they showed visual and cognitive tunnelling quite dramatically. So we found that not only did they show this horizontal squashing of their visual fixations, they showed a vertical one as well. So it demonstrated that they really were looking at a highly focused area of the driving scene in front of them, which might explain why a lot of research is showing that when people are talking on the phone, they claim not to have seen signposts that they've driven past, even when eye tracking data suggests that perhaps they did. So there's something going on cognitively which is affecting their perception of that visual scene.